I don't just record this, I'm going to go insane. So I'm just gonna record this. Whatever happens, happens. If I sound silly or say or like 1,000 times, that's fine. Okay, so welcome, good morning, hello. I'm Zahra, and today I want to talk to you about the books I read in January. So I read 12 books. Technically I read 11 books, but I'm finishing up the 12th, so I'm going to include it in this video. And I'm not going to go in order of books read. I'm going to go based off of the format because it's easier that way. So I'm going to talk about the books first that I have physical copies of, and then I'll talk about the audiobooks and the ebooks and stuff. So this is my stack of books that I've read, physical books that I've read this month. Here's the funky little stack. Yeah, let's just talk about it. So the first book that I wanted to talk about is Wilde's Encyclopedia Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This is a book about a character who is a researcher at Cambridge. She goes to this very wintry, beautiful, gorgeous area to research fairies. I just blanked because I got a message, but yeah, so she goes to research fairies and then finds love along the way, discovers fun secrets along the way. It's very, very cute, very, very lovely. I gave this, I think, it'd be nice if I had my ratings in front of me. Okay, so I give this 5 stars. I absolutely enjoyed it. I read it pretty quickly. It's not super big. I kind of like handled it so much that it's a little bit faded here, but I love this. It was so fun. It was so easy to read. Yeah, I thought the story was so charming. I thought the story was so heartwarming, and I really enjoyed it. I love the main character, and I really think she's different from a lot of main characters that you read in fairy stories, famous ones that we know. But yeah, I thought this was such a fun spin on like fairy stories. I haven't read anything else like this, so this was very much like cozy fairy fantasy, and I really had fun with this. Okay, the next book I read was the second book in a trilogy called The House with the Golden Door. The first book, and I think the trilogy, is called The Wolf Den, and it basically follows the sex worker in Pompeii very long time ago, obviously before Mount Vesuvius erupted. And it follows her trying to get out of the situation she's in, kind of gaining power, seeking more than anything autonomy. I thought it was really impressive the way that the author approaches this character, and I forgot to say the author's name, Elodie Harper. You can see it down there. This story is really interesting, and I really love the descriptions of the place because it provokes really rich imagery in your mind. I think the first book did more of this than this one. This one was much more heavy on the plot, in my opinion. I think the first one did have a plot, but that one, what spoke to me for that one was more so the descriptions of the place, especially because last summer I went to Pompeii for the very first time, and then a few months later I read The Wolf Den. I just thought it was cool because I had pictures of some of the descriptions that she had written down. But yeah, I really like this. I don't want to get into spoilers because it is the second book, but it's a continuation of her story of trying to find power. I think it's also a story about figuring yourself out when you come out of a really difficult situation, or like when you're dealing with someone who's cruel, trying to avoid becoming cruel too, if that makes sense. The next one I want to talk about is a very chunky book that actually took me a really long time to read. And what ended up happening is I read about half of it with the physical copy, and then I realized if I don't use a different medium, aka audiobooks, to read the rest of it, I probably will never finish it, or it'll take me a really long time. It was a book that I definitely wanted to read, but it's so content heavy that I really needed the audiobook to like keep me focused. So I would crochet. I just recently learned how to crochet, but I would crochet while I was listening to the story, and I really enjoyed it. And that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. I really enjoyed this book. I loved this book. I thought it was so well written. I think it's so important. I remember when it first came out, a lot of people were talking about the place of fiction and dealing with like real world topics, and I think that she writes this really well, and she does a really good job addressing the issues and concepts that she is dealing with, like colonialism and racism and discrimination and knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge and what happens when you as a quote-unquote outsider, try to assimilate in an environment that might not necessarily want to see you as human. I thought it was so beautifully written, and I gave this, I think 4 stars, but it was closer to 4.5 to 4.75. And the only reason it wasn't a 5-star read for me was because it was so content heavy that it was hard for me. It was more of a me problem, I guess. It was hard for me to read it consistently because it was so heavy. It did feel sometimes textbooky, and not in the way that it was written, just in the amount of information that we were getting aside from the plot itself. You can kind of see where I dropped off from reading the physical book and then kind of went into the audiobook. I love the audiobook too. The narrator was great, so I would recommend reading this either way. This next one I have a physical copy of because my friend loaned me the physical copy. I ended up listening to the audiobook for this because A, it was a very big book, and B, I'm kind of a mood reader, so I was just out and about one day and I was like, you know what, I kind of want to start this book, and I had access to the audiobook on script. So anyways, I decided to start listening to the audiobook. And I think that was a mistake. I think it took away from my experience of this book. Let's talk about it. Fourth Wing. This is a crazy one because I've seen so many varying opinions on this book, and I kind of feel like I'm in the middle camp. I don't hate it like a lot of people do. I also don't love it. I think it's just okay. The best way that I can describe my feelings towards this book is I like the story because I love fairy stories and I love romantasy, and full transparency, I loved the ACOTAR series. I absolutely ate that up. It was the first book series that I read that was like fairy romance, fantasy, whatnot. So I really, really loved it. Upon rereading it later, I realized I didn't love the writing. And I think I have the same problem with this, is the writing just felt kind of amateur for me. And then what made it worse was that the narrator was just awful. The narrator sucked, like actually fully sucked. And so it really took away from the story itself. I think I like the dragons. I didn't love the military propaganda, but I just kind of took it with a grain of salt and was like, you know what, it's just a story. Anyways, yeah, I didn't love this, but I didn't hate it. I gave it 3 stars. This next one is the book that I am currently reading. I'm about 2/3 of the way in, depending on the ending. I think that this next book is going to be my absolute favorite read of the month, and probably one of my favorite reads of the year, and that is Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reid. Like, first of all, this is such a pretty cover. I'm obsessed. I don't really like having like people on my covers, but this is just like the colors and stuff are so pretty. And the story is just so interesting. I went into this a little bit blind. Like, I'd heard it was good. It's like, yeah, it's a gothic retelling of the juniper tree, but I'm not super familiar with the juniper tree. I should probably read it, but again, I wasn't super keen on looking it up anyway, because I was like, let me just read this as it is and then I can look it up. But I love the description. It's so beautiful. I love the world building. I love the characters. I love the interactions. Oh my gosh. All the reason this was so surprising to me was because I had read The Wolf and the Woodsman last year, and I actually didn't like it very much. So I wasn't sure how much I was gonna like this, but I had heard so much about it that I was like, okay, let me give it a try. And I definitely think this is such a step up, in my opinion, from The Wolf and the Woodsman. I love this book. Highly, highly recommend. Having an absolute blast. Okay, so now we're gonna move into the books that I listened to. Okay, sorry, I got sidetracked. But I'm gonna go into the books that I read via audiobook. Okay, so first book I'm gonna talk about is One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. It's a romance novel. It is basically about this lady who is married and then her husband goes missing. And that's about the extent of the summary that I'm gonna give you, because that's kind of what I knew about the book when I went into it. I know that the actual summary gives you more information than that, but I read it knowing that much, and I think that I enjoyed the story all the more because I only knew that much. As a side note, I don't read a lot of romance, or I used to not read a lot of romance, so I'm not super familiar with the tropes and stuff. Like, I'm familiar but very vaguely. I didn't know what to expect while I was reading it. I was just like surprised a lot. And also, I think Taylor Jenkins Reid is a really talented writer. I really like her work. I have read Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones. So I kind of knew that it would be pretty good writing. I did enjoy it, and so I gave it 3 stars. The next book, I'm going to talk about them in clumps. I did read a bunch of books by the same author. I wanted to read them because I was like interested in reading as many romances as possible this month. I don't know why, I just kind of felt like doing that. And then also because the narrations are by Julia Whelan, who is like a really great narrator. She's one of my favorites. She actually did, I'm looking at my books over there, but she actually did The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which I listened to twice last year. I was like, okay, let me see what she's narrated, and it turned out that she had narrated a bunch of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books and Emily Henry. So I was like, okay, let's listen to these. So the next one by Taylor Jenkins Reid that I listened to was After I Do. I like this even less than I liked One True Loves. It was just kind of dumb to me. It's about this woman who is married. Their marriage starts falling apart and they are not having a good time, so they decide to have a separation and see other people during that time. And I did not like this. I simply didn't like it. First of all, it was kind of boring in terms of the story. I guess I expected something different from the ending as well. After like everything that you go through with the main character, I expected something else to happen at the end. This was on the lower end of like the 3 stars. Just didn't like the story. The last book that I listened to by Taylor Jenkins Reid was Forever Interrupted, which this was such a sad book. I cried a lot. It's basically about this woman who loses her husband when they're newlyweds. Like they've been married for like 11 days, something like that. I didn't expect for it to be emotional to me just because you find out about the death so early on in the book. So I was like, okay, there's no way I'm really gonna care about this in retrospect, which has happened with other books, but I just didn't think it would work. And it did, and it was really sad, and I cried a lot. So I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars. Yeah, I gave this 4 stars. And the next 2 books that I read were by Emily Henry. So the first one I read was Happy Place, and I really enjoyed this. This was another emotional one, and surprisingly emotional, because I've read other books by her. They have like emotional elements. This was a lot more emotional than her other books to me, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I did cry. I was very invested in the story. The only thing that I was like a little bit iffy about was the ending, and it wasn't even because it was not necessarily the ending I wanted, but I was like, you know, a little bit just like surprised. I don't know. It was a shocking ending, which is weird, and I think like is something to consider because of like the entire trajectory of the book and the backstory you get on our main character. So that's probably more of a me thing than anything else. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. The next one that I read was People We Meet on Vacation, and I did not enjoy that. I didn't like it. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. I think I don't love best friends to lovers, and I think that part of the reason is because the 2 characters are best friends, but then they have other partners, and then there's like borderline cheating. I just don't like the idea that other people are getting harmed because these people can't just communicate. I think that's the best way I can put it, and this whole book felt like that. Emily Henry is a great writer, and I love all of her other books, but this one was just not good for me. And I still gave it 3 stars because Julia Whelan did such a good job in narrating, but the story itself I did not enjoy. So the next one I want to talk about is a very short book that I read. So I was on Scribd, and it was only 5 hours to listen to, and I was crocheting, and I read it in one sitting, basically, sitting down and like working on my scarf, because that's like the only thing I can make right now. The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. This is basically a book about books and reading. It was a really good book to read in January. It's a good book to read at the start of the year. So I would highly recommend it, even though January is over, to read in February if you wanted to. It really does deal with the concept of like the number of books we read, the way we consume books and interact with them, what we kind of carry with us when we're reading and what stays with us when we're reading, and how much attention we pay to the books we're reading, where the value of reading comes in. Is it more valuable if you read more? Is it more valuable if you read less but you pay attention, like annotating, highlighting, you know, spending more time with the book? I just thought it was such a good book to read at the beginning of the year, because January, I, for myself at least, did a really good like amount of books read, but that's because I don't have school right now, and once school starts it's like harder to sit and read for me personally. I have more things to do, I have more things to be thinking about. While I'm happy with how much I read this month, I'm still thinking like, okay, what am I gonna do later on, like in February, March, April, when school's going on? And reading this book was just a comfort because I was like reminded that you're not in a race against anyone. I don't even think you're in a race against yourself. I just think that reading is about going into books that sound interesting. They're good, they're not good, whatever, but taking something away from them regardless. And it doesn't matter if you read 100 books in a year or 20 books in a year or 5 books in a year. What matters is that you read and you interacted with them and took something. Even if it's just the idea that I absolutely hated this, you took something out of what you were reading. And so yeah, this book was like a reminder of that. So I gave it 4 stars. But yeah, so that was The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. And finally, the last book that I'm going to talk about is Woman Eating by kohda. And this was another book that I was like very, very happy about. I'm so glad I got to read this. I'm so happy that I read it. I really want to buy a copy of it, and probably will do. And it's basically about our main character who is kind of dealing with drinking blood and the thirst that comes with drinking blood, and the amount of control she exercises over herself, and also her mother tries to exercise over her. The whole point of this is to be a metaphor for eating food and eating disorders, and control is a huge one. It really is about the way that we deal with food, the way we view it, the way that sometimes it can just consume our thoughts, and you know, being all consumed by the prospect of consumption. I think I'm gonna put it that way. Ultimately, the way that too much control and too much obsession with the way we eat food and like controlling ourselves and our urges and our hunger and our desires can sometimes lead to an utter loss of that control. I thought that the prose was very beautiful. It was very, very well written. Definitely felt like the hunger and the like just insatiability of the main character in the writing. I think this is a story that will definitely stay with me long after I've read it. Big sigh on that one. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. So that was Woman Eating by kohda. So yeah, those are the 12 books that I read this month. I hope that if you haven't read any of them, I explained it enough that you might want to look into them. I'm gonna put down my Goodreads link so that you can see my ratings, because I think halfway through I forgot to say what the ratings were. I hope these were interesting to you and you decide to read them, and if you do, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought. Even if you hated any of the ones that I loved, or vice versa, you loved any of the ones I hated, I'd love to hear about it and why. I'm going to put my Goodreads and my Instagram in the description so that you can add me on any of those. And yeah, thank you for bearing with me in this like awkwardness, like the awkwardness of being in front of camera and being perceived. But yeah,